I still had to learn to leave space for grief because I grieved the opportunity, not the environment. Hey y'all, welcome back to the Fast Forward podcast. And I'm excited to introduce a new topic for this month, and that is grief. I think that the idea of embracing grief is really important right now because a lot of us are seeing institutions, mindsets, groups, communities, relationships, opportunities just completely dry up, and it can be really overwhelming. I have unfortunately had quite a bit of experience with grief, especially over the course of my adult life. And so I thought it was important to spend some time this month specifically speaking about how to manage your grief as a leader. And especially when we think of it in the context of how we still need to show up at work, whether we are a senior leader in an organization or an entrepreneur who still needs to run their business, how we have to manage grief is perhaps a little bit different than someone who does not have leadership responsibilities. I want to start the conversation off, especially for this topic I'm about to go into, which is career grief, with acknowledging that grief is a process. So, of course, most of us have seen the 5 stages of grief, and which is a relevant model for sure. But even with those 5 stages, sometimes they don't always happen in a linear fashion. Sometimes you jump around. Sometimes you have to sit in one phase for a very long time. Sometimes you have to revisit and go backward and then come forward. And I think the more we can embrace that lack of predictability, the discomfort that we feel as we navigate that process, the better off we'll be. So what do I mean by managing career grief as a leader? Sometimes as a leader, let me back up. In this country, and dare I say in Western society, the typical pathway that signals career and professional excellence is moving into people management. So I would say it's only really emerged in the last maybe 10 to 15 years, if even that, where you can be a high level individual contributor or IC. Most of the time, if you were a great worker, how we knew you were a great worker is that we added on the responsibility of managing people. And everybody is not meant to be a people manager. Full stop. Like I'm gonna be honest, I don't like managing people. That is not sexy to me at all. I don't like it. This is probably why I keep a very lean team. But in most workplaces, that's how you know that they respect you. Now they put you over a team. And for some of us, we took on a team reluctantly. Some of us took on a team and leadership responsibilities around people management because we knew that that was the best way to get more money. Some of us took on those responsibilities because we knew that if we didn't, we would just stagnate in the company and we wanted to stay there. So there are a number of deeply complex reasons why people may have taken on a leadership role that are completely valid. But there's still some grief there because you may not have wanted to manage people. You may not like people management. You may not be good at people management, and you still might have to do it. And I want to create space for you to grieve the individual contributor career that you lost because people management was the only way forward and the only way up. I want to sit with that for a second. If you know that you would have loved to be an individual contributor, how did that impact you to now have to be responsible for other people, especially when you inherit a team? So sometimes when you can build your own team, it's like, all right, I'm just going to build it with folks who I know will make this process easy for me because they're so good at their job or they're so well known or maybe they're more outgoing. And so I don't have to always be on the mic or whatever the case may be. But when you inherit a team and you inherit a problematic team, you got to figure all of that out. And their productivity, their performance, their buy-in and adoption is what pays your bills and keeps you employed. There's some anger, there's some resentment, there's some frustration there that can be hard to get on. And so the first question I want to lay out for you is, how did that impact you to have to take on something that you really didn't want? Are you okay? What would you have done in your career otherwise if you could have done something? Is that still an option for you? I think some of what we see with folks and what we have come to call a midlife crisis is really a grief of only being presented with a single path. And so sometimes we make it about socioeconomic status. Sometimes we make it about gender, right? So midlife crisis, and yes, it can be very destructive. But the more I talk to men, especially in that range of 40 to 60, a lot of men that I'm talking to are very clear that the life they have was not the life that they wanted at all, but they did not feel that there was any other way. And so they just kind of stuck. And because so much responsibility has been placed on them progressively, it's just more and more and more and more and more. And this is in their professional and personal lives. By the time they get to the point where they're like 45, 50, 55, it's just an implosion. Like it's like a kid throwing a tantrum, to be honest. And it's not that I don't have empathy for the people who have to deal with the fallout of that, because that is heartbreaking and very disturbing. But I do have some empathy for the fact that there is a long road of adulthood. Like, if you think about adult, like, you a kid for 18 years, but if you live to be 80, 90, even 70, you an adult for a long time. And once you become an adult, folks expect you to have your life together permanently. And it's just not realistic. Like, you just not going to be able to keep it together that long. And I'm learning, because I done had to I done blew up my life, crashed and burned my life like 2 or 3 times, and had to rebuild that thing from scratch. And I'm only 40. Like, I'll be 40 here. And I'm like, dang, man, like, this is a lot trying to keep it together for a long time. Like, I'm holding open dear life. And mind you, I ain't got no kids. Most of the time I had no spouse. So I can only imagine what it's like if you had kids in your 20s and you got married in your 20s and you tried to hold it together for like 50 years. It's a lot, y'all. It is a lot. And it's just not realistic. Like, it's just not realistic. So even with your career, like, a lot of people started working at 13, 14, 15, 16. You work until you like in your 60s. Now you probably work until you in your 70s and 80s. You're bound to have some grief. Like, it's impossible to make it through your entire career with no grief. Whether that's the job that you didn't take, the job that you did take, and you like, why did I do that? The time you didn't take the opportunity to relocate for a new opportunity. The time you didn't start a business and you wanted to start a business. The time where you did start a business and you realized, I should have stayed at somebody's job. The time when you took on a business partner and you shouldn't have. The time where you didn't take on a partner or didn't hire staff. Like, life is full of opportunity costs. And what we don't calculate when we're calculating the trade-offs is the grief that comes from that. That's the variable that we can never quite calculate, because the tricky part about career grief specifically is that career grief is a compounding grief. So it's not just the one decision you made and you're like, dang, I should have made something different. It's watching what you think would have been all of the alternative outcomes play out, and you grieve every single one of those. So in my career, there are moments I have where I'm like, I should have stayed at such and such job. I should have stayed there. I should have did that. And it's not always because of what I think I would have been doing now. Sometimes it's the grief over the pain that I had to experience because of the choice to walk away. One job I left, and at that time, that was the most money I had made in my career. And when I left, I mean, I went into like almost abject poverty overnight. Like it was a really, really tough struggle. And I went through some serious financial difficulty. And those 7 months of difficulty took me probably about 7 years totally to work my way out of. And of course, the feeling came up for me like, should have kept that job. But I also know that the third, fourth, and fifth degree consequences of leaving that job never could have happened if I had stayed, because there were opportunities that came again months later that I was able to take. I wouldn't have had space to take all the steps that I needed to seize those opportunities. And so my logical mind knows, oh, yeah, you needed to leave when you left, but my heart still hurt because I'm like, man, that sucked to go through that financial difficulty. That sucked to feel like I was a quitter, like not just of that job, but of myself. That was an ego bruise. And so the complexity of career grief, and this is probably where I want to leave as a parting thought. The complexity is not just in the decisions you make, but it's in the compounding impact, which is based on the alternative outcomes that you then see from afar. And a part of embracing career grief is being okay with the complexity of that emotion. So I had to learn, and I'm going to talk more about this in a future episode this month, but I had to learn, just like I had to learn to embrace my emotions because they come to pass. So I feel something, it's a signal to me, something that I need to zoom in on, address it, and then move on. Grief is the same way. It's an emotion that's coming to signal something to you. And there are some moments where you can reclaim what you're grieving about. So maybe it's the grief of a lost connection to a mentor or a mentee or some professional connection. And you're like, you know what? I hate that I didn't do something about that then. And so you reach out to them now. That might turn into something. And sometimes it's things that we can't get back. The job you left, and it's no longer an opportunity for you to go back to that company. When you relocate and there's no longer a door open for you to come back to re-seize that momentum. But regardless of whether you can reclaim or can't, the importance is acknowledging and being okay with the grief that you feel, because that grief is valid. That grief is signaling to you of something that needs your attention. And I think for a lot of leaders, and especially for entrepreneurs, we see grief as an inconvenience. So it's like, I don't have time to feel this. I got da-da-da-da-da this due. I got this to work on. And yes, you do. But grief is sneaky. And when you don't give grief the attention that it wants, grief will sit you down. There are very real, lasting consequences of unaddressed grief. And I'm not going to say unresolved because, again, I don't think that grief necessarily needs to be resolved in the way that we think of resolution. Like, grief is not a problem to fix. Said it's just a signal. So I wouldn't try to fix my happiness. I wouldn't try to even fix my sadness. I'm just experiencing it. And grief is the same way. And so I would encourage everyone who is up hearing this to leave space for grief. When you don't address grief, grief settles in parts of your body. And some of this kind of gets into Eastern medicine practices around emotional, physical connection. So the emotional connection to your health, how emotions sit in very specific parts of our body. I would encourage you to go research that. I'm not going to get into that. I've done a lot of research on it. I wouldn't consider myself an expert though, and I want you to take ownership of that journey for yourself. But it's fascinating. And I found it to be true in my own life many, many times, that as I addressed where grief was sitting in my body based on certain illnesses that I was having, that freed me to not only get physically well, but emotionally well, because I was addressing what the grief was trying to tell me. And because our careers play such a huge role in our lives, it is extremely important to not detach completely from the impact of career on our well-being. So, of course, we had a thing now, your career is not your identity, da-da-da. It's not your identity, but it's an expression of your identity that is quite significant. So what I do for work, everything from this podcast to executive coaching to strategic planning, all the stuff that I do, it is a reflection of who I am as a person. It's a reflection of my hope, my sense of purpose, my spiritual beliefs, my morals, my ethics, all of that is wrapped up in it. And so when I'm showing up at work in a work capacity, and even what I choose not to show up as or in, that is a reflection of who I am. And so the moments when I feel emotionally unwell, physically unwell, a lot of times I could trace that to something that was happening in my career. Like there have been times where I was going to take a deal or sign a contract or work with a person, and I felt physically sick. And I was like, where is this coming from? What's going on? And when I checked in with myself, I realized that not only was that a bad decision, right? So that was helping me to make a decision then, but I realized that that person really represented some part of me that I hadn't addressed. So I kept having the same type of supervisor over and over again. And eventually I realized that this supervisor was really a reflection of my very toxic relationship with my mother. And I've talked about that like in parts and pieces on the podcast before. But a lot of my resistance to being controlled and manipulated stems from the boundaries that I've had to set with the matronly figures in my life. And that typically showed up as my mother and my aunts. Because of the way they treated me as a kid, I find those same patterns being replicated in my career. And so over the years, I've had to step away from many environments where I knew there's no way for me to get out of the clutches of this same type of personality. And so even though I grieve the opportunities that I hoped I could have at that job, that company, in that place, I know that the alternative was to continue to put myself under the thumb of those same toxic personalities that I sought to escape from as a kid. And so it wasn't worth it to me. And even though I know I made the right choice in stepping away, I still had to learn to leave space for grief because I grieved the opportunity, not the environment. And by allowing myself to grieve what I believed and what in some cases was a lost opportunity, in some cases I've been able to reclaim that and repurpose that desire for that opportunity in my own company. So the dope part about having my own company is that I can make any service I want to anytime, like it's my business, literally. And so I do that. Like when I feel like I want to be really creative and come up with something, sometimes I just come up with something for a hot second. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to go back to an old journal. I'm looking because my journals are in a particular place in my office. But I've had to go back to an old journal and it was a little idea I wrote down or something I put on a piece of paper at work. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to do that now. And then I can feel it's almost like the blockage like dissipate in my body. The tension dissipates. So here's what I'll say to you. I would encourage you as a leader and as a founder to leave space for grief. If you find yourself feeling that pain in your heart, that tension, that discomfort, the bubbling in your stomach, the tightness, revisit where that is stemming from. And sometimes it can be very difficult. I would encourage you to do so with a therapist or even with a coach, because sometimes it can be hard to even articulate it. Sometimes you can have quite visceral reactions to remembering certain things. And so you just want to create a safe space for yourself. But leaving space for that grief is so important because you will not only find forgiveness for yourself and sometimes for others for what you lost, but also you may just find opportunities for what you can still reclaim and repurpose in your career. So let me know, what does career grief mean for you? How do you manage career grief? Are you okay with experiencing career grief? And how can you leverage the grief that you feel to be able to create resolution, but also reclaim and repurpose? Let me know down in the comments. And of course, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I will catch y'all on the next one. Bye.